Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. This is Suzanne Knabe-Nicole from Police Science Doctor. You're joining me here on a live interview with Dr. Matt Bland. Let me just show you who that is. And he's waiting backstage. He'll be speaking to us very soon. We're going to talk about how to reduce crime by 40% using hotspots patrols. It's some recent research that he published. I have just spoken to him and told him that I'm feeling a little bit rusty doing these live interviews. I haven't done one for a while. If anyone is online who's maybe seen the last one, can you please remind me? Just comment where you are. This is being streamed to Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Just put in the comments, please, which one was my last interview. And even if you haven't watched any interviews here before, just pop into the comments who you are, where you work, what kind of area you work in, and which country, because I found that there's usually some really good networking going on in the comments section. So this is an opportunity for you to meet like-minded people in the comments section and ask questions and get them answered. So I'll just briefly introduce Matt. I haven't actually got any. So that's the first thing I forgot, to have like a proper bio in front of me, but I'll tell you what I know. So I have known Matt for a while. We used to work together at Suffolk Police. We then used to work together at the Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing. His background is in crime analysis, and he's done a lot of research on domestic abuse. And that was the last interview I did with him on this show. It's on the Police Science Doctor channel. And obviously, we're talking about something different today based on the research that he's published more recently. He's already associate professor at Cambridge University, something obviously very prestigious at that. And if everybody's ready, let's just see if he's ready as well. And welcome to the interview, Matt. How are you doing?
Hi, Suzanne. I'm okay. Thank you. How are you?
Good. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us today. So many people, maybe just one or two, may not have seen our last interview together. So for those who don't know you, who are you and why might people know you?
It's always strange to say, why might people know you? I'm Dr. Matt Bland. As you've already said, I work for the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge. You may, if you're into evidence-based policing and you do the rounds of these kind of things, then you may have come across me at the Cambridge conference or talking on analyst training courses, or you might be one of the half a dozen people who's read something that I've written. So I've in the last 3 or so years since I've been actively publishing, I've written 3 books on various topics around evidence-based policing, and a number of papers in peer-reviewed journals, of which the paper we're going to talk about today is one of them. I have various other hats and gigs that I sort of pursue. So I'm the independent chair for the Home Office's technical reference group looking at reviewing the police funding formula. I'm the trial director for the national trial of domestic abuse polygraph tests with high-risk domestic abuse offenders. And I'm a board member of the American Society of Criminology's Academy for Experimental Criminology.
Right. So I didn't even know of these hats. I did think you were going to tell us that you're going to the Lederhosen-infested beer drinking festival in Germany next weekend, which is what you told me earlier. And you promised to put up some pictures of yourself in Lederhosen for the Oktoberfest. No. Okay. Well, lots of more professional hats that I wasn't aware of. So obviously, well done for that. We've got Marla Friedman, police psychologist from Illinois in America, watching. She's a good friend of mine. Hello, Marla. Please, yes, do introduce yourself in the comment section. And also, if you've got a question that you would like me to put to Matt, please start your comment with a capital Q, and then I can ask him the question. Matt, you mentioned evidence-based policing. That's very, very much a growing practice. Can you please maybe give a short definition of what it is? Because most people think of the term evidence in the context of policing when, sort of about DNA and forensics, but we're talking about something different here. What is it?
Yeah, so it's the application of scientific inquiry methods. Very much, police science, as is in your banner, is the same domain as evidence-based policing by and large. It's about why did police do what they do in both terms of tactics and strategy, and making sure that that's got a firm basis in evidence, in the sense that empirical research is evidence rather than evidence, as you say, you would submit before a court. It's very different in that respect. The word evidence, the term evidence in evidence-based policing it comes from evidence-based medicine or evidence-based education or evidence-based management, which are other disciplines that have the same core philosophies of basing practice in good science and good scientific method, and it's no more complex than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We're also you and I are both very much involved with evidence-based practice, and you obviously still working, I assume, with the Cambridge Centre of Evidence-Based Policing, and I support the Societies of Evidence-Based Policing. We've got the big global conference coming up on the 12th of October, actually. So there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of collaboration going on online, and there's actually the English-speaking countries so far have been the forerunners in this. So this is something that's very up and coming. Anyone who wants to work in policing should really keep an eye on what's going on with evidence-based policing, because that is the way to go. And yeah, so we're both quite embedded in that process, but I recommend that everybody sort of get involved in some way. So tell us about the research that you did, please. Was it in Bedfordshire where you had the 40% crime reduction? How does that work? It sounds fantastic. Anyone, maybe just tuning in, we're talking about how to reduce crime by 40%, and Matt is going to tell us how to do that now.
Well, so there's some caveats that you need to put around that. Okay, we're not talking about all crime. This was a project looking at how to reduce a particular type of street violence and robbery. So very serious end of the scale, and a big priority for the government in the UK. It's also the 40% reduction is in the severity of the crime rather than the numbers of crimes. So the numbers of crimes that were reduced in this randomized control trial were about 25%. So it's still pretty substantial in the grand scheme of things. And that, is sort of the first hook whenever you're sort of talking about this trial. It is 15 minutes per day of intervention, manifesting itself in a 25% reduction in street violence. You're quite right, Suzanne. That's something that piques people's interest. This is kind of, quite useful that we start with the definition of evidence-based policing, because this is evidence-based policing in action, really. Toward the top of the pyramid of evidence, so these sort of highly internally valid causal designs. So what I mean by that is, how can you put in place an evaluation of something that you're doing and be sure that when you draw inferences at the end of that evaluation, that you've got a high level of confidence that the thing you changed is responsible for the outcomes that you saw. And it's a common strand of research methodology that the randomized experiments are up there. I'm not going to say the trope gold standard, but they are up there with the highest quality of designs if executed correctly. That's the big if. You can't just put a randomized experiment into the field and assume everything's going to be okay. And I can talk a bit about how everything wasn't okay through the application of this study. The intervention that we were looking at was the presence of a uniformed police officer walking around a location which was mapped out. The officers had those locations for 15 minutes in a day, and compared to what happened in those same areas on different days when the officers didn't walk around. So we had a number of areas across Bedfordshire, which, as you name check, is a county in the east of England. It has quite a big urban conurbation, which is almost like a borough of London, just outside the sort of London area. And then it has a number of other smaller sort of market type towns, but it has been identified as one of the top 17 police agencies in the UK for levels of knife injury at the time that we ran this experiment. And the government funded this piece of work. So Bedfordshire were looking around for, what tactics and can we employ that are going to give us the best returns in terms of addressing this violent crime problem. And that's where evidence-based policing comes in, because the body of evidence around place-based strategies and about dealing with violent crime in particular points towards what they call hotspot patrolling as being probably the most consistent intervention that will yield results. There have been experiments all over the world in do visible patrols deter people from committing crime on the street, and that evidence, it has varying different degrees of yes, look, this reduces crime, but by how much? The overall sort of direction of travel is fairly moderate if you look at the systematic review that Anthony Braga out in the state and colleagues out in the States conducted. But it's pretty consistent in saying if you do these studies, then the chances are you will have a positive effect on reducing violent crime. I can see there's a question which says, is this predictive policing? No, it's not. It's nothing to do with Predpol. What we wanted to test in Bedfordshire, what Bedfordshire particularly wanted to test, was this kind of emerging theme that started in Perth in Western Australia in about 2019 with a couple of the other speakers at the Global Evidence-Based Policing Conference, Jeff Barnes and Simon Williams, who were working out there at that time. We're looking at how long can we actually maintain this deterrent effect for in particular areas. So they took Perth, they cut it up into city blocks, and then they shuffled those city blocks so that sometimes a city block would receive a patrol for a short period of time, and then on other days it wouldn't receive the patrol. And because they did that randomly, you'd have city blocks that were getting a patrol 1, 2, 3, 4 days in a row, and you'd have others that just by dint of chance would not be getting them 1, 2, 3, 4 days in a row. And the outcome of their experiment was they found that you could send a patrol in, and the deterrent effects, the suppressing effect on crime rates actually lasted for about 4 days. And then crime would start to seep back up. Now, that is quite an attractive variation of hotspot policing, because from a resource point of view, you're looking at it thinking, okay, well, I can get more efficiency from my deployment of resources here if I can have that 4-day window where I don't need to deploy officers to go and do these proactive patrols, even though they're a short period of time. So the purpose of the Bedfordshire experiment was to replicate this method seen in Perth and see if that effect was also present in Bedfordshire, and they could deploy on an ongoing basis that sort of 1 on 4 off strategy. As it turns out, and this is the sort of case for replication in science and why you can't, in evidence-based policing or any evidence-based anything, necessarily pick up one study and drop it in somewhere else and expect to get the same results. What we saw in Bedfordshire was actually, it was the opposite. We needed to have a consistent approach where officers were going into areas 1, 2, 3 days consecutively to get the optimal results. On that 3rd and 4th day, there's very, very low crime when those strategies played out. There are some notable differences though. Perth and Bedfordshire are very different places. Perth is a big city. Bedfordshire is a much larger area when you think about geographic scope. And the hotspots that we identified for officers to patrol were also quite large compared to Perth. So while Perth was looking at more of a city block type scenario, about 200 meters by 200 meters, in Bedfordshire we're talking about much larger areas where the officers couldn't physically be present in all of them. So they were using their professional judgment to walk around within the confines of the hotspot and go effectively follow their nose, but make sure they're seen, make sure they're engaging with the community. And that's why we say 15 minutes a day, which is a translation of what the officers were doing, although sometimes they were doing more and sometimes they were doing less.
I've got a number of questions. So obviously you said in the beginning that this is not an overall crime reduction of all types, but specifically street robbery, correct?
Yeah, street violence and robbery, yeah.
Violence and robbery. And you also said it's the severity that actually went down rather than the crime count?
No, they both went down, but by different amounts. So the volume of crime went down by about a quarter, 25%, and the severity of those crimes, as we measure them using a crime harm index, went down by 40%.
Okay, can you just please explain briefly to everyone who's not familiar with crime harm versus crime count, what the difference is and why it's actually really important?
Yeah, of course. So that in crime analysis and criminology, there is a sort of prevailing view that not all crimes are the same. It's not particularly controversial when you take it in those terms. A homicide is more severe than the theft of a food item from a shop, for example. Those are obviously extremes, but then there are varying degrees within there that you might apply. You might say a rape offence is more severe than a minor common assault, for example. The question is, how do you weight those crimes separately and then have some sort of valid instrument for measuring them? And various scholars around the world have come up with different instruments for doing this. The one that we use on this study is unashamedly and quite logically the Cambridge version, which weights different crime types by the minimum level of sentence that an offender could get at court. So these are the guidelines given to judges for when they make their sentencing decisions. So the actual weighting is expressed in number of days that a person would go to jail for, at the very lowest possible level, which makes it consistent across the board and takes out any aggravating factors which would be individualized to unique offenders. At one end of the scale, you have a homicide, which would be up around 5,600 days for one offence. Robbery would be something like 365 days by comparison. So a big spectrum across the board. And it's by taking a mean of those from the areas on the days that we did the patrols, comparing it to those when we didn't do the patrols, that's where you get the 40% difference. When the patrols were happening, the actual count of crimes was 26% lower, which is great news. But the severity of those crimes using that metric was 40% lower. So the message there is this is moving the needle in the right direction, but it's also moving harm reduction to a greater extent than it's reducing crime based on count alone.
Yeah, and once you understand that distinction between crime harm and crime count, you realize that actually it is harm that we need to look at reducing a lot more than crime count. You briefly explained to Lee Oakley was asking on LinkedIn if this is predictive policing. You said it isn't. Again, can you give a quick definition of what predictive policing is and why hotspots patrolling is not predictive policing?
Hotspot policing could be predictive policing. It's just not in this respect. And I'm obviously interpreting what Lee means by predictive policing. So if I use the common story of PredPol, the algorithm which divides places up into blocks and then applies its algorithm to predict where the next crimes will happen, and the idea is that officers are then deployed on that basis to go to those locations dynamically and prevent those crimes from happening. And that's kind of the general philosophy of predictive policing. Can you use the data to predict where we need to be? We started off looking at whether we might have a system like that in this experiment, just as the overall piece of work. But what we found quite conclusively was the most violent places in this jurisdiction don't really change. They're quite chronic when you take them over a course of months. So that really helped with the research design, because what we've used here is what we call a crossover design, in which case you're applying your intervention and your control to the same unit. So that we divide, say, Luton, this town which is just outside London, up into its different jurisdictions, and then we will be sending patrols in on some days, measuring what happens, and not sending them in on other days. And the comparison then is between the days when we did the patrols and the days when we didn't. So all the environmental factors in that jurisdiction are constant across the 2 days. So you can rule all of those out as potential other explanations. we therefore didn't need to predict where violence was, because it was highly predictable in the sense that the best chances of finding violent crimes were always in the same locations. So in that respect, it's not a dynamic model in the way that Predpoll or equivalents would generate.
Could you briefly explain as well what exactly a hotspot is when it comes to, in our context, policing and patrolling?
I mean, it can be dozens of things in terms of how you define it, but they always come down to the same thing. It's where most crimes are happening. So you face questions around how big should the hotspot be? What shape should it be? How does it sort of cross different, does it cross a road, for example, things like that. Those are all technical decisions that analysts will need to make when they're doing this kind of work. But these have sort of been around in scientific literature now for, I think, sort of 1987, when sort of Larry Sherman and others started their sort of Minneapolis experiment, started looking at this concentration of crime, which David Weisberg calls the law of concentration. Is very well established that crime generally concentrates into a few locations, also between a few people, a small segment of the population. And that's where this type of experiment is really founded. And hotspot policing as a strategy is really based on these principles that you will get the best rewards for your resource investment, if I can put it in those sort of crude economic terms, if you target the problems in those areas. And the harm metric, as you allude to, Suzanne, gives you a slightly different perspective on that, because it's not just about the numbers of crimes, it's also about the weighting of those crimes too.
Yeah, so a hotspot is both geographical and also temporal. So, for example, places that are part of the nighttime economy, pubs, bars, and these kind of things, they are probably a hotspot for certain kinds of crime, public disorder, drunkenness, but only at certain times. So you can't, well, you can, but you wouldn't get much from doing a hotspots patrol on a Tuesday morning outside a nightclub, because there's no one, pouring out of there, but you could have some benefit on a Friday or Saturday night, for example.
Yes.
We've got another question from Marla here. How do you manage scheduling? This is outstanding research. Most officers here work 10 or 12-hour shifts, some with no time off for 7, 8, 9 or more days off. How does it work?
With a lot of effort. Scheduling was a problem, and I think it probably comes on to Lee's point below Marla's there. So we had officers take out GPS trackers in this experiment, because we wanted to know that they were going into the hotspots as we assigned them. And we could sort of monitor live time where they were, though we didn't do that. It was all done in retrospect. The common challenge we had throughout this experiment, and the follow-up one that we actually did last year, was officer availability to go and do those patrols. There is, and I think there will forever be a priority for the radio. When there's an urgent call comes in, officers will go, and that's how it should be. And that, with the number of officers that are often available, presents a challenge. So, it's a real challenge for evaluators to have to deal with, let alone how practitioners have to deal with that in the real world. We came up with various different strategies, ranging from daily oversight by commanding officers who would be, actively encouraging, if I can put it like that, officers to go out and do that, and then notify them when they've done it. They looked at isolating resources, so they could provide a sort of dedicated pool to go out and do it. And actually that had quite a good level of uptake, because those were just officers just assigned to go and do this work. There is a sustainable issue there, though, because there's always demands for officers and dedicated teams like that. And I think with anything around crime prevention, and again, Lee's hitting the nail on the head, I think, there is a view that if you are out doing a foot patrol, you're doing some crime prevention work, that's not equal to reactive work, which should take a higher priority because there's always so much to be done. And there's a long-term cultural challenge in this area, I think, to try to shift the balance so that kind of proactive foot patrol is seen as actually reducing demand further down the line, because you're going to have 25% fewer violent crimes if that result extrapolates out. Then there'll be 25% fewer investigations further down the line. So if you sustain that strategy for long enough, you would hope to see some easing of that resource demand. But I'm straying into unicorn thinking territory here. Okay, there's no guarantee that it will sustain. There's no guarantee you could sustain this for long enough to actually feel that relief in demand. And these are just the challenges that police decision makers have to make. So there's nothing unusual there. This is just another piece of the jigsaw that they have to wrestle with.
This is a massive topic, isn't it? I mean, Lee is talking about how they try to use predictive policing in Kent Police here in the southeast of England, and they felt it failed. I think a perpetual problem with policing is, one, it's very slow to get anyone to agree to actually do something radical, to try and do something different, because everybody's so overstretched with all the reactive stuff, because we're not doing enough prevention. That's why there's so many things we need to react to. We need to, go to all the calls that come in. And that is a big problem, because we need to somehow get enough officers involved and enough members of staff involved to actually doing predictive work, so that in the longer run, or even in the medium term, we can reduce all the calls that come in. But how do you balance that when you have very stretched resources? So it's very difficult to convince police leaders to try out something different. And then I think there's also a massive issue with implementation. And I know that, from speaking to some of the academics and practitioners who have managed to run, large research projects like you have, there is an issue with implementation. Officers might be told to go to certain areas, but they don't. And they're not checking in, or they're not doing this and not doing that. They're doing things differently. So implementation is a very, very big problem. And somebody might have a great idea, and even if it does get authorized, if the implementation is not sawn through, if you don't see the implementation through properly, then it may well look like the thing didn't work, but actually it would have done if it had been done properly. But that's very, very difficult to achieve sometimes. And Matt, how do you think the culture is sort of preventing good change and preventing good initiatives in this context?
I'm not totally convinced there's a pervasive cultural problem that's the obstacle. I think it's more an issue of competing demands and priorities. It's difficult as a researcher. The research is your top priority. It's what you're there to do. But we have to acknowledge that operational police officers and support staff have got inboxes which are just overflowing, and it's one more thing they have to do. So I completely sympathize with that position. I think what levers you can pull are more strategic, potentially in the first instance. It's around how do you channel special funding towards initiatives and ensure they're evaluated to a high standard so you can understand the outcomes. How can you make sure that evidence-based practices are seen through and forces are actively encouraged to do them? And there is some progress being made in both those respects, I think. You've got, for example, latest round of Home Office grip funding has come. This is for international viewers. It's the UK government's funding for violent crime reduction is now being allocated with a provision to spend a certain percentage of it on understanding the outcomes of the work that's gone on. Now, it doesn't necessarily solve the immediate problem of competing demands, but what gets measured gets done in policing. And once you start measuring, well, how did you spend the 10% of the budget or the 15% of the budget in terms of evaluation, you can then start to see tangible tangible outputs which will contribute back into the evidence base. The other side is then what oversight is there for your policing profession around what they're doing? How are they being inspected and monitored, and how is that inspection regime connecting with evidence that's out there? That is a plate of spaghetti. That's really difficult, particularly in places like the US, where there's tens of thousands of agencies and no singular oversight body. It's hard when there's only one oversight body in a country, and some of that's to do with the complexity of the evidence base itself. So, I mean, the way to sort of think about all of this is baby steps, and this is part of a journey. If you look at evidence-based medicine, which has been around for a lot longer than evidence-based policing, it's not problem-free either, and they're more than 100 years ahead. So it's easy, I think, for the research community to be frustrated by some of those things, but it's just real life. This is how practice works in this area, and it's just something we'll have to adapt to.
So speaking of baby steps, if somebody's watching this somewhere in the world and they work in a police force or police department, and they think, okay, I think it would be great if we could try that here. But they and their supervisors maybe don't know much about implementing any new tactics or research designs or evidence-based policing. How would you suggest, in very simple and clear terms, how they should go about it? What can they do with what they've got available?
I think there's always, I place quite a high priority on knowing and this is a terrible management speak term, the right stakeholders in their organizations who are going to pull the levers or be the enablers to getting evidence-based practices to work. Because you could go away and you could read the articles and you could come up with a lovely plan for developing some form of evidence-based intervention. But if you can't understand the context you're operating in, or you can't win the hearts and minds of the people you're going to record, and this is a common theme for particularly back office staff, police staff, crime analysts, they aren't necessarily in control of the resources that will need to go out and play ball to put interventions into the field. So there's only one way around that, and that's to collaborate with those people. I think the evidence-based policing community is a big and growing one. You happy with the curtains?
Yeah, so it's just too much light coming in from the side. So I didn't mean to distract you.
So it's a big and growing one. There's loads of people out there, and there's probably people in individual organizations who are into this stuff or have started to become aware of this stuff, because it's just becoming a more and more common part of the conversation. And I think you've got to look, first of all, you've got to look to understand the evidence base. If you're sort of tuning into this thinking, look, I can go and do patrols in my jurisdiction, which is nothing like Bedfordshire, and I'm going to get the same result, that's probably not going to happen. So you need to understand how you can interpret the evidence that's out there in the first place, and then you need to be able to understand what sort of conversations you need to have in your own organization to get to a point where you can try something, and then it's about learning from what you're trying. And it's a cycle that you have to go round and round with. Not easy.
There are quite a few resources, obviously, online. The College of Policing has in the UK has the What Works Centre, which is basically a list where you can look up projects that have been tried and tested in law enforcement. That's what evidence-based policing is about, something that has been tried and tested. And they're listing initiatives and practices that have been tried and tested and what the outcomes were, and if they actually are shown to work or not. You can Google evidence-based policing, and lots of many different resources will come up. There's videos. I've made a video with several videos on evidence-based policing, interviewed people on evidence-based policing. I've got a free mini course on evidence-based policing. So if you do have an interest in that, there are lots of resources you can take advantage of. And often people like Matt here, for example, are wanting to work with police forces. So if you are aware of any academics in your area, wherever your police force is, do perhaps get in contact with them. Personally, I think that it would be great if every police department, every police force had some kind of researcher in there. I mean, we have researchers people called researchers, but my first job in Suffolk Police, for example, was as a researcher, and it's basically just looking at systems and putting information together for people to then do something with. So that's different. What I'm talking about is somebody who has an understanding of how projects should be run, how evaluations should be run, has some kind of clout in that organization to say, okay, look, we're going to implement a trial, speaking to the operational decision makers. We need to do some research on this. How do we structure this best? This is how we're going to set it up. This is how we're going to implement it. This is why we're doing it. There's evidence base here, an evidence base here, or we need to contribute to the evidence base. This is how we're going to evaluate. This is how we're going to check if everything works. I also think that every police force should have an investigative psychologist in it. But so if anyone wants to implement that would be great. I think it would be very beneficial for most police departments. I know that some police departments in America have a handful of people, so 10 officers. That might not be enough perhaps to warrant all of that, but then maybe somebody in the region can have access to other regional experimenters and researchers and people who really want to be embedded in policing and want to get some of this research knowledge into policing. And I think that would possibly help a lot if that role existed. But again, somebody needs to make the decision that it's worth in the long term to make this investment in someone. Is that something you think might work, Matt? Would it help or not?
I think it's difficult with individuals. So I mean, there's no doubt that every law enforcement agency can benefit from having some capacity to understand what it's doing. But I think that there can be a tendency to say, it's particularly in small agencies, to invest in 1, 2, 3 or a small team and kind of think that's the job done, or that will lead to the job being done. And with evidence-based practice, it's a much more systemic issue that needs to be addressed around how do we do what we do at all levels. So it definitely the research capability is a key part of that journey, but it can't be the only one. I mean, a research team is nothing without data to work with. So there's a step even before having research capability. But you could have both those ducks lined up in a row, and then if your executive decision-making functions are not brought into assessing evidence or using evidence as an integral part of the strategy, then again, it's the system will fail. So there is a whole system. I'm doing full management lingo in this interview, but there is a whole systems approach that needs to be considered to doing this in the right way. And that's why I sort of say, baby steps. You've got to do these things. Only do this one bite at a time.
We've got a question here from Michael, who's watching on YouTube. He's saying, good day, not to stray too far from the area of concern, but do you see this research being applicable within the private security industry, where patrols of neighborhoods and businesses are concerned?
Yeah, 100%. And there is evidence already out there to say, it doesn't have to be police officers who are patrolling to have a deterrent effect. So the mechanism here that we think is at play is deterrence theory. By having a sentinel, a guardian in a place where an offender and a potential offender and a potential victim are present, you raise the perception of risk to the offender to the point where they are deterred from committing the offence. That absolutely has been shown to have worked successfully in places like train stations with private security guards rather than sworn officers. It's been shown to work in places not too far from Bedfordshire with sort of unique role that we have in the UK, or it's called police community support officers, who wear a uniform, but they have no powers of arrest. They can't detain you. It is this kind of guardian looking in, which is the key to making these strategies work, and that absolutely, in that context, absolutely applies to the private sector.
Mm-hmm. We've got a question here from Stanley. He's at a military university in Indonesia. Is your research also concerned with how to reduce crime if the police are suspected of being criminals themselves? Is this form of crime covered in your research as well?
Not in this paper, but I have other research projects ongoing that look at police misconduct in other senses. I mean, there's a recent study that came from the States by David Weisberg and his team, which looked at how officers deal with people in the community and whether that has an impact on hotspot policing strategies. And this, generally viewed that if the police are not seen as a legitimate agent of the state, then they will not be able to influence crime suppression. And that's different. Obviously, it's contextually different in all different nations. That how the extent to which that is important in places like the UK, the US, most of Europe, where policing by consent is well established. It at the moment is not a critical issue, which is not to say it's not an issue at all. And you perhaps can see worrying trends in the sort of uptick in assaults on emergency workers, on officers, as a symptom of potential problem there. But at the moment, that effect doesn't appear to be suppressing the deterrent effect that hotspot policing strategies can have broadly.
Can you explain briefly what we mean by policing by consent? This is a very big part of UK policing, but many other countries will not be familiar with it.
Yeah, sure. So it's effectively the other end of the spectrum to sort of paramilitary policing. Officers aren't armed, regularly. They the upholding of the law requires the consent of the public to allow police to carry out their duties. In a nutshell, there's far more members of the public than there are police officers. So they have to give if it's non-explicit consent for police officers to say stop and search them in the street or arrest them. And we're talking at sort of macro scale of consent rather than individual consent levels here. But the key to having that consent on a wide basis is legitimacy. Do the public see the police as legitimate agents to carry out the intrusive actions that they often do, arresting you or searching your house or stopping your car and asking you to account for yourself. That's the sort of foundation, particularly of British policing, where there's no routine arming of police officers.
So it's Monday today. Every Tuesday, for those who know or for those who don't know, I publish 3 police science snippets. So I go through lots of journal articles that are relevant to policing and criminology, and I try to find 3 that are practical and useful, because a lot of research is very, very specific or very abstract, and it's just not going to be relevant to many frontline officers. But something that I'm sending out tomorrow as my police science snippets is research that found that if there is a police officer involved killing of a member of the public, which was seen as controversial, and there were protests after that, and there is an external investigation going on, in that area, the homicide rates actually rise, because we know that in terms of police legitimacy, people behave better if they feel that the police are justified. They break the law less. That's one thing. So it's safer for everyone, but it's also better for policing. When there was a controversial shooting and there's an investigation, there were protests, people kill each other more. So it's not against the police directly, but it's against each other, because the trust in the community breaks down towards the police. And also, obviously, the police are very reliant on the members of the community to come forward with information. Somebody has been killed next door. There were shots fired here, and I saw something, and I want to tell you about it. So that's quite interesting. This double-sided effect that the perceived loss of legitimacy, even if it's temporary, can have on the public and the police.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we answered that question. I want to show something. So you've written 3 books in the 3 years you've been at Cambridge? Is that right?
Yes.
Come on, you can do more than that. Just 3 books.
Not all. It's not all.
I haven't written a single one, so that's still fine. So obviously, tell us about this book, and I'll also post the link into the comments for anyone who's interested in this.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's obligatory to hawk some kind of product that speakers have, right? That's I'm permitted to do it.
Yes.
This is a book that my colleagues Barak and Alex put together with me. It's part of a suite of methodological texts, which I know doesn't sound the most interesting thing in the world, but you can buy this one individually, as Suzanne's put on there. It's on Amazon and other places online. What we're trying to do in this book is explain this kind of high tier of research design where you want to understand the effect that whatever it is you're doing is having on whatever it is you want to impact. So, for example, in this study, we're putting foot patrols into high crime areas and we're monitoring what happens to crime rates. And the way to do that to a sort of high level of integrity is sort of paved with all sorts of intricacies. So this book is about trying to deconstruct the different elements of experimental research designs. It's not just about randomized controlled trials, but that is a big part of it. And we also sort of explore other potential methods that you might use if you're not able to do a randomized controlled trial. And there are hundreds of reasons that you might not be able to do one. It need not be the end of your aspirations to come up with some kind of causal inference. So I thought while we were talking about experiments, it would be a good opportunity to flag this book up. And we try to write this as accessibly as possible. It's not a textbook. It's supposed to be an introduction to this type of design. So where we're using technical terms, we take some time to explain those. There are lots of case studies that we introduce into this book, which explain different elements of experiments using police trials as a example points. So hopefully it will, if you're keen to understand, and that can be both in terms of carrying out this research yourself or understanding it when others do it, perhaps this book might be able to help you.
Okay, I hope so. You did mention earlier that randomized control trials are not the gold standard. Now, I always tell my students they are. So do I need to rethink that? Why are you saying that?
It's a debate that rages, I think, among it's not just criminologists, but criminologists do have the debate. I think it's probably too simplistic to say they are the gold standard. I think that's why I sort of try to move away from it. I mean, if you sort of do any study in this area, or you might have talked about it, Suzanne, in your snippets around the hierarchy of different research designs. So going from sort of observational studies at the base through before and after studies, then introducing where you have a comparison group, but that comparison group might not be a precise match for the group where you're trying something. As you go higher up that pyramid, what researchers are trying to do is eliminate all the other possible explanations for why the outcome is changing. And as the book explains, probability theory, if you randomize enough cases into your intervention in your comparison groups, you'll eliminate all of those other potential explanations just by virtue of probability. But that's a theory, right? Okay, so there are loads and loads of unobserved things that might make your assumptions invalid. So as I sort of alluded to earlier, you could do a randomized control trial and actually it's not very well set up, or the execution of it is not great, even though the design was great. And it doesn't actually give you any strength in your causal inference. That might not necessarily manifest itself in how the statistics are presented, for example. But that's the reason, I think, for a reservation around saying, look, this is the gold standard. Because I think when you call it the gold standard, it sort of, people sort of say, well, that's what we should aim for. And again, thinking about the pragmatism around operating in social science in a practice field like policing, you can't always operate the rigor that a randomized controlled trial requires, where you've got to have really firm grip over what people in your experiment are doing. So my line on this is, don't just despair because you can't do that, or because it's just out of reach. There are other options there which will help move you along this pathway of understanding what works and what doesn't, that don't have to be a randomized controlled trial.
Yeah, that's always a danger, isn't it? That just because people working in the police realize they can't run a big randomized controlled trial with hundreds of data points or hundreds of participants, that doesn't mean that they can't do tests or they can't do evidence-based policing. And it's very important to keep it accessible. And that's one of the big challenges in policing, I think, empowering individual officers, individual members of staff that, you can actually do something, just go and read up about it. Speaking about evidence-based policing, I would like to show this as well. So this is the conference I mentioned earlier. I'm going to put the link into the comments. They don't show up everywhere, but they should show up on, hopefully, at least YouTube and LinkedIn. But just go to global conference, globalebpconference.com. And this is a 24-hour conference starting in New Zealand. New Zealand are very much at the forefront of evidence-based policing. They're doing really well with this. And then they're broadcasting live from a TV studio for 12 hours. And then London is broadcasting live from a TV studio for 12 hours. And there's going to be lots of very interesting people presenting there. And I'm a media partner for this conference. So I'm helping them out in sort of getting the word out there. And there's some very good content coming your way. So go to globalebpconference.com and register for that. And I hope that you find something of use in there. Matt, unless there haven't been any more new questions, is there anything else that you wish I hadn't asked you about and given you a chance to say that you haven't?
Still embarrassed about the lederhosen bit, but no.
I'm looking forward to it. Well, fair enough. Then if you could make one change in policing, what would it be?
Oh, God, no, you didn't warm me up for that.
You said that last time. You should know by now.
More funding for evaluation.
Oh, good. Nice one. Okay. Well, with those words, thank you very much for the time today, Matt Blunt, Dr. Matt Blunt from Cambridge University. Thank you very much to everyone else, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps, and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main website on policesciencedoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address, and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.